My name's Luke Ledwich, and my companion with the iPad is Andrew Glover. And today we're going to talk about AR streaming and how we use AR streaming to create an AR spectating experience for World of Tanks. So, who are we? Andy and I work for Wargaming Sydney, which is based out of Sydney. We are a technical studio that supports all or most of the Wargaming products on numerous fronts all across the world. We work for Echo Team, which is a small client team which focuses on emergent technology, such as AR. Now, while we did most of the engineering work on this project, we were definitely not alone. At least 7 other teams helped us from around the world, especially on content creation. So anything that looks really nice, it was probably someone else. So before I get started, I wanted to give you a little background about what we're going to talk about. So I'll talk about the background of the project, our Gamescom experience, which is where we showed this off, and the lessons we learned both about delivering at a large games conference and just in general, and lessons about AR interactions, because this was fairly new to us and we learned a lot about how people actually just interact with AR itself, as well as the current challenges that AR streaming faces the technology and where we can go from there. I'll then hand it off to Andy, who will get into the technical details of it, a lot of the latency and bandwidth, which is our main constraints, and then all the smoke and mirrors that we had to do to make it actually work. So, succinctly isn't a word you can apply to what we're actually doing, and it is really much better to show it, and unfortunately we're sort of in a halfway state because live demos have already failed on us. So we're going to try and show you what it looks like partially, if this works. Yep. Give it a second. Okay, I will I don't think I can actually get rid of that. At right now is you're looking at the full graphics fidelity of World of Tanks 1.0 running on ultra settings, being streamed to an iPad and displayed as an AR experience on the table. The content you're looking at is just a gameplay replay presented by World of Tanks. The area was selected for a lot of explosions and exciting gameplay, but this year it works out for any replay made from our branch. Now, the hardware used is just a relatively high-end consumer PC with a 1080 card and an iPad Pro. Now, traditionally we have actually been able to use AirPlay to stream the full experience from the iPad to the crowd, if that's as well. But unfortunately, the demo gods do not smile upon us, so you get this moderately ordinary. Now, the other thing I want to point out that alongside the content you're looking is we have a choreography file. This choreography file basically dictates the zoom of the experience you're seeing. So it will set it up to fit on the table, and it also fast forwards to the exciting moments. Now there's nothing stopping us showing you the entire map, but the tanks are really, really small and the explosions are quite underwhelming when you're that far away. Alright, I'm going to cut you off. I don't know how to make it quiet though. Alright, I think we're in business. I'm going to show that later. Okay, so describe briefly what it works, but a little more detail on the actual system itself. So we start with the iPad, which is a standard AR application. It requires to view the world, compute the vision, gyroscope, gain its position in the world, and it takes that position in the world, and particularly the position relative to the center of the table, and it sends that coordinate system to the client. The client takes that coordinate system, runs it into the engine, and then from there it will render out the frame from that camera coordinates. The choreography file I mentioned will dictate the zoom, so it'll dictate how far away that relative distance to the table corresponds to the actual distance in the game world units. And then on top of that, we crop it to a nice square location so it fits on the table, and we remove the skybox. So from there, that frame that we just rendered out is encoded and streamed back to the iPad, where the iPad will decode it and do some adjustments so that it works out into a nice AR experience that is relatively stable. So, the motivations behind this. World of Tanks has done a couple of AR experiences in the past. For the Bovington Tank Museum in England in 2017, they added a AR tank into a collection. So the museum had an entire collection of Tigers bar one. There's only like 2 of them left in the world. So they basically added an AR one. And you walked across real tank, real tank, real tank, AR tank. And they also released the World of Tanks AR app, which basically put one of the tanks on any surface you chose. So you'd point your mobile device at a surface and you could put a nice tank there. You would have a battle with another tank and there would be an airplane, and it was a nice experience. The problem with both these experiences is they are true AR, so they had to be built for the device and they were bound by the device's capabilities. So it required custom content to be built, a custom application, and whatever other peripherals were needed. So the motivation was when World of Tanks Graphics 1.0 came out, with the nice graphics updates they wanted to put that in an AR experience. And the first thing is an iPad can't do it. There's no way it can render at that level of graphics processing. So AR streaming was the motivation, and they gave it to Echo Team, and we had 6 months to do it and get it to Gamescom with a little bow on top. And it would be a very short talk if it didn't work. So we got to Gamescom, and this is it. If you've never been to Gamescom, it is quite a show. There is 400,000 people over 5 days from 120-something countries, all there to just play games and see what's new. The crowd you can see there is actually a small crowd. It's not very much. But the 2 tables in the center was our experience, and we were showing it off to anyone who wanted to come up all day, every day. We had about 2,500 people come through, which is about 1 person a minute. And we also had a business and press area where we had another 2 tables which were a quieter experience, where we could actually talk about the technology and show it off a bit better. So it was my first major conference, and especially demoing something at a major game show. And there are a few lessons that came out of it that I think I'm obligated to share. So that's what a real crowd looks like. That's the main hall at any given day in Gamescom. There is throngs of humanity, and you probably even can't see it, but in theory they are being directed into 2 halves by lanterns down the middle that you just cannot even see. And the crowds make everything slow. So I had 20 minutes before my next interview. I said, oh, I'm just going to check the other station. I'll go down to the client's thing, see how they're going. Back in 10 minutes, it'll be fine. That's how long it took me to walk. It took me about half an hour to get there on the actual day. It forced me into the merchandise hall. I didn't stay too long, but the crowds make everything hard. Food, bathrooms, everything. The lesson here was to be prepared. We actually got a couple of push bikes, and you could literally ride out of the conference, down a side road and back in, way faster than you could even walk for 1 conference hall. The next learning is hardware will fail, and it will fail spectacularly and in weird and wonderful ways. So we rocked up there with a good amount of spares, but within 2 hours, 2 of the PCs had died. One of its cooling systems just gave up, and another motherboard just beeped at us until we got rid of it. Overnight, 2 of the PCs lost their content enlistment. It literally corrupted spontaneously. So either aliens or gremlins were involved. And we had, part of our setup is this wonderful little dongle for USB-C to USB-C. We thought we had plenty. We had like 7 spares. 7 broke. It's no good reason. It's just hardware failed. And we had lots of other little hardware fails. So the answer there was, again, be prepared. Come with spares, and if you don't come with spares, have a backup plan, which means knowing where the nearest JB Hi-Fi or equivalent is and going to grab it. And the last thing is, be wary of stages. So this wonderful mock tank that we had is right next to the 2 tables. It was spectacular, and it's pointed directly across the way at the stage of Wargaming. Whenever there is a stage show, those people all on the right descend on your stage. No one could actually come to our booth when there was a stage show on. No one could walk through, no one could hear anything, except for the fact that tank cannon is real and fires off periodically at an incredibly loud volume. So some of our attendants had earplugs for most of the session. So be wary of stages, they can block off entire routes. So if you are directly across from a stage, you may find your demo limited. So, one of the two big questions that came out of Gamescom was everyone asked was, why? Like, why would you do this, and when? Now, the why is super interesting, because one thing we learned from this is there's not a lot of things that AR can do that is more compelling than just an on-device experience, either on a PC or an iPad. However, AR is an experience, and there is nothing quite like it. It is a fantastical placement of a virtual world in the real one, and you don't get that on either scenario, because it's the mixture of the virtual and the real that makes it great. It's so compelling that if there's anything wrong with it, your brain will rebel and it will drop the immersion and you will give up on it. It also provides a couple of effects that people have seen in traditional sort of art and media, is this diorama effect, where if the scale of what you're looking at is small enough, you'll be compelled to come in close and investigate things, look at flowers, look at bolts, look at explosions. And coupled with that, that's a bit unique to AR, is the Dollhouse Effect that we call it, which is the compulsion to look through windows and investigate spaces that you can't immediately see. So it forces you around the table and to move and to investigate. The other thing that AR is really good at is it is the most intuitive camera. Mouse and keyboard might be fast, but it's really poor for looking and investigating. Whereas an iPad is natural. Anyone can point a camera. You can give it to your grandmother and they could go and see your latest replay in World of Tanks, if that was your intent. It's also very responsive. It is a one-to-one mapping. So if you move a meter to the left, you will move a meter's worth of world space units directly to the left. There's no scaling or whatnot. It makes it a very responsive interface. And the last thing is, if you build your AR device on game state, you get all the benefits that come with that. So you can look anywhere. You're not bound to the original game players. You're not bound to their avatars. You also can control time. We had a slow motion button that we used a lot, and they can slow down explosions. And you also can have custom UI, whatever you want. It could be really large titles over every player in the game. It does not work in an actual game because it gives away where all the enemies are, but for a spectating experience, that is very natural. Now, what we learned was how people interact with it, and they were very much not the same. And they weren't any one of these categories, they were more a combination. But loosely speaking, this is what we had. So we had the botanist. This is the person who picked up the iPad, went to the smallest feature they could see and investigated it for 5 minutes. There could be 5 tanks exploding and they want that one blade of grass that's gently swaying in the wind. That was counted to the statues who just wanted to sit back and watch. AR is meant to be a slightly mobile experience. It's based on you moving the iPad. It actually doesn't work if you don't move the iPad, but they would just want to stand there and watch and see everything unfold. And there's the acrobats who are diving around the table, and the tether is getting very close to being ripped out every time they move. And then there are the testers who are just trying to break it. They just want to find where the edges of the experience and where the magic stops. So they're waving their hands in front of it, they're covering the camera. And all these things, people did it in various levels. But it was very interesting to see how they interacted, because we didn't know any of this before we did. And it's a good guide, and if you are going to make an AR experience, you will probably find new archetypes of how they'll interact. But these were definitely the ones we encountered. Now, coupled with that is what makes a good experience. And it's quite simple. It's anything that keeps you immersed within the experience. Now, if you look at the image on the left, we have what we call a skirt. This is a artificially added quad on the side of the floating terrain that basically grounds it to the table. Instead of being this magical thing floating in space, it looks like it's sitting on the table. So anything that helps it sit on that table in real life completes the immersion. The same is true of, as I said, the mixture of virtual and real. So anything that is high and see-through is very compelling. Smoke that goes into the air, it forces them to look up and they see their friend's face through an explosion, and they love it. So these are the things that make a good experience, because you just basically keep it immersed. Now, one of the other things is sound. We didn't actually think sound would be a big part of it. But we actually noticed that we forgot the sound in the press booth for the morning, and the reactions of people when they had sound, and that basically they could see the explosions corresponding to everything that happened, it brought them into the experience, made it more immersive, and it made for a better experience. They were much happier. They would jump, they would bounce, they would recoil when things exploded at them. And I did mention custom UI, I think I have a slide. So the AR-specific content. This also brings people into the experience. Large floating text that is clearly part of the real world now was something that they really liked. Off-table experiences, we had some in development. We had a plane that would fly overhead, and again, the noise would bring you in, and you would look up, and you would see what you expected to see. You would see a plane flying over the terrain. And again, that makes you look up, it makes you experience the mixture of real and virtual, and it keeps you in the experience, and, well, basically experiencing it more. So what distracts from the fun? And it's pretty simple. It's anything that breaks the immersion. So what we learnt very quickly was your brain makes it real. If there is a tree in the virtual world on that table, trees don't move, and your brain knows that. So if that tree moves without their input, they can't put their finger on it, but they're instantly out of the immersion, they don't like it. So we had panning between events, we had zooming, we had tank following. All these features were cut because it broke the immersion. Funnily enough, things that were slightly more fantastical, they're fine with. Towers rising out of the table, that's fine. Things fading into the table, that's fine. Slightly magical. Like I said, the grounding skirt binds you to the table. If it doesn't bind you to the table naturally, it's fake. So when I think you can just see it in this thing, but overhanging tables, people don't believe it's true. They want there to be physics, so it has to make sense on a subconscious level. The testers who would wave their hand in front of the screen would quickly realize that their hand doesn't show up because there's no actual depth field in the experience, so we can't place real objects in front of it. So that would break the immersion. But if you have a table in front of them, it's really hard for someone to sort of jump in there inadvertently, so unless they're trying to break it, they can't. And physical discomfort. The iPad is not weightless. It weighs a lot, and if you hold it there for 10 minutes, your arms will get tired. You'll also be immersed in this experience, and if you walk left and there's a chair, you're going to stub your toe, or the table, or someone else, or anything. So, and again, if you stub your toe, it kind of breaks the immersion. So, coming back to the why, well, why do you want to use AR streaming? I've told you why you want to spectate in AR, so why do you want to use AR streaming? Because it looks better. There is no mobile device out there that can make content that looks as good as your PC. That gap between PC and mobile hardware, it may be narrowing, but it's not going to close anytime soon, and it may never. So this technology is, in theory, a future technology. It will always be a gap, and you will always have an avenue for streaming really high-quality content. The bigger benefit for all of us is you don't need to port. So if you want to make an AR experience for any of your games, you will need to port to mobile devices or headsets. With AR streaming, you don't. Your engine just needs to support it. So it needs to support rendering out a frame and sending that frame over a wire. It needs to support receiving camera coordinates. And it should support the game state replay, because that just gives you a lot of features. It's not necessary, but it is something that's an added bonus. If you support that, the third-party app, you can use a third-party app to actually do the AR streaming. There is nothing World of Tanks specific in the iPad portion of this tech. So, when can I have it? This was pretty much the second question. They said why, and then they said when. The answer is right now, sort of. So, we are currently tethered, so we have a nice long cable between the PC and the iPad. That's for a number of reasons that I'll get into right now, into a little bit. But you can create content with this. So again, the mixed reality experience is rather compelling. So like a weatherman with a green screen and all the weather behind it, Wargaming teamed up with the History Channel, and we did an episode on the Battle of Kursk. So we had Richard Cutland narrating the Battle of Kursk and giving people information about all the tanks involved, and he had a green screen battle going out in front of him, and he was directing and informing as it went along. But the reality is, when can I have it now? They want it on their phone, they want it now. It's not an easy question to answer. To get a little more context, you really need to know what we went through to get to this stage, so you can understand what we need to do to take the next step. So the technology is rather agnostic. There are a lot of AR options available. Major ones, especially for the handheld, are of course AR Kit and AR Core, but the features we use are very basic. We just use plane detection, so you can get a decent estimate of the height of the table, and we use image references, so that you know where the table is in the world. That just gives us a nice repeatable loop for identifying where to place the experience. That's in all AR supplies that I know of. On the hardware front, we settled on an iPad because we wanted it to be large. And at the time of writing this, it was the only AR-supported tablet. It gave us a few benefits that we'll cover later, but the iPad was the biggest visually spectacular thing we could settle. And we originally settled on Unity, not for any advantage, but purely because it gave us an opportunity to test out a whole lot of hardware technologies like HoloLens and other future devices and whatnot before they came online. We settled on only one, but at the start we had a lot of options as we investigated. So I spoke about the tether. It was a constraint. It wasn't an enabler. Basically, there would be no satisfactory wireless on the floor at Gamescom, so we had to use a cable. As soon as we had to use a cable, we were suddenly bound to USB 2 speeds, because that's all a Lightning connection enables. Fortunately, iPad Pros have an unlisted feature. They actually support twice the bitrate on their Lightning ports, and this is not mentioned anywhere. The only way to get access to it is through a USB 3 camera adapter, designed to rip images off a digital camera quickly. This thing requires power, which was a blessing and curse. So you can see the top line, which is a bunch of Apple cables with the wonderful USB to USB adapters that they all broke, to the power supply. And then on the other side, we just needed a third-party Ethernet connection, because all Apple ones are bound to 100 megabits, which is not very fast. And so that is the Frankenstein cabling that we had to use to make this work on the floor. It's not required. This can be done in wireless. We did it in development. But there are a few problems with wireless, especially latency, that Andy will deal with later. Now remember I said power is a blessing. So one of the catches of this is the AR experience that we have running uses every part of the iPad. Basically, the runtime we can get on an iPad is about 2 hours, and that's while connected to power. So it was rapidly being drained, even while being charged. The first solution to this was, hey, we can get a bigger power supply. There is a 30-watt iPad charger that delivered to the iPad enough power to be positively charged. So great, we're positively charged. It's a curse because charging is very heat intensive. I don't know if you know about this, but your iPad will melt very quickly if it is charging and under active use. And when it starts to melt, it degrades performance quickly. So we showed up to Gamescom. We had 3 whole days to get ready for this, and we took it pretty casually to start. There's no air conditioning on, the shutters are open, there's a sunbeam on our tables, it's pretty nice, and we plug it all in and it dies in about 10 minutes. And we start to panic. People run out to the stores. Remember I said the backup plan? So we ran out of stores, we got some backup iPads, we got some backup cooling pads, we ran around like headless chooks for about a couple of days, but we did end up with a couple of solutions. And one of them is you can revert back to the previous negatively charged power source. That will not generate enough heat. So in the press area, where we needed the device to run constantly for hours on end, it actually would decharge after about 2 hours, and we would swap it out. On the floor in Gamescom, basically we timed the customer experience so that they only had the iPad running for a minute and a half, because that's about all we could sustain. And then it went on a cooling pad, and it had a minute and a half to cool down before we gave it back. So that was another constraint. If this goes in the wild, that kind of has to be addressed, because no one likes their phone to run out of power in what would probably be 20 minutes. And I'm going to hand off to Andy for the technical details that we all set up.
Thanks, Luke. So I'm going to get into a bit of the tech, and then I'll move on to a bit of the future of what we can do with this sort of thing in the future. So what did we deliver? We basically got the full World of Tanks experience with all of our fancy new graphics onto an iPad at a 2K resolution running at 60 frames per second. As Luke mentioned, we did that without needing to port anything, without needing to down-res anything. It's the full experience. How did we do that? Well, if the title of the talk didn't let you know, streaming. So what we do is, there's two ways to the streaming. First, we need to get the camera back to the PC. It's fairly simple, just sending the camera's rotation, position, and field of view back to the PC, and we bolt that straight into our normal camera system. From the PC back to the device is the technical part, where we're taking the full 2K RGBA buffer and sending it at 60 frames per second back to the device, which is a hell of a lot of data. So in order to get it there, we need to do some compression. We did a few separate things to try, but in the end we settled on probably the most simple solution, which was just to take the buffer and BC1 compress it, which is the DXT format, for those in the know. I won't describe it now, but you can look it up if you need to. Effectively, it just makes it blocks. That takes you down to about 20% of the frame size, but that still wasn't enough. So we decided to take advantage of the fact that things like the black around that screen is all completely transparent. We don't need to send anything for that. And most of the interior is fully opaque, so we don't need to send the alpha. So we sent a mask on top of our calculated buffer, and I managed to strip back, for an addition of a 6% on the mask, we managed to strip back to another 25 to 50% on what we needed to send, and thus we're able to send at 60 frames per second on a gigabit link. We did try, as I mentioned, H.264. The problem there was no alpha, so we couldn't really get there, and decoding it on the iPad is a more tricky operation when you're dealing with something like that. So the most important part, I've mentioned 60 frames per second several times. That's because it's super important to be hitting that frame rate for an AR experience. We initially targeted 30, but even though when you were moving, you could tell something was wrong. Luke mentioned it before. There's something in your mind, you may not see the problem, but you feel the problem. And that always takes you from the experience. In order to maintain that 60, we needed to get the compression down, but we also made sure that both the device and the PC were running at 60 frames per second, so that every camera we sent, we'd get an equivalent frame back, and all the time they were in lockstep. We also made sure, as we're sending UDP packets, they can be lost, they can be delayed. The client would always extrapolate the next frame, so there's always a continuous form of movement while you're moving. You don't want to have two frames that are the same all the time, because that's going to, again, trigger your mind and you're going to be taken out. We also made sure that by doing everything on the PC on our 1080 graphics card, the iPad was relatively underutilized, so we had almost the full power of the GPU and the CPU just to render simply a quad to the screen, so we could do some more advanced decompression and push everything onto the GPU there, which is way faster than you can do on the CPU. You just have to make careful that if you completely max out the GPU on the AR kit, it does use part of it in the background to do its AR, to track in the world where you want to be. So you can't actually use the entire GPU you have available. Make sure you don't do that. So with our frame rate, we move on to the main problem, which is the latency. So latency, as we define it, is the camera sending from the iPad until we actually render that associated frame back onto the iPad, which, if you can read those tiny little numbers at the top, goes up to about 70 milliseconds. Most of it is set. The 16 milliseconds you have to render the frames on both the iPad and the game are set. The areas where you can try and reduce that is in that midsection, when we're compressing, when we're transferring, and when we're decompressing. With the one thing to make sure of is that you can't do each step individually. In order to compress to transfer faster, you're going to increase that compression step. There were other compression methods we tried, like LZW compression on top of what we already had, but the savings we got in order to send faster did not outweigh the amount of compression time we had to add on to. And you'll notice the decompression on the iPad is significantly larger than the PC side. It's just the weaker system. So always weighting your compression to the PC and allowing for as easy decompression as you can is always preferable. So obviously we can't run 70 milliseconds per frame, so we parallelized everything. All the frames we're sending, we're compressing, we're transferring are all stored in effectively a circular buffer, so we're not locking at any point or potentially hitching or deadlocking. Everything just overwrites memory that already exists. We have enough on the iPad, given we're not actually doing anything, to have as many. We have up to 30, 60 frames stored on the iPad at any one time. And that allows us to run it and hit everything at 60 frames per second. The most important part is the transfer, and that's always pulling from the socket. We would always run into issues if we weren't pulling from the socket, in that it would overload the TCP. The TCP would throttle you back and you completely lose your gigabit link, and there's nothing you can do about it. It just keeps perpetuating on top of itself, and you'd lose your 60 frames per second, which is obviously your most important part. So the issue, where do we get the issue with latency? Well, the issue is floating. If you look at in the top, there's that candy cane coloured stick. You'll notice that the corner is moving around. It's not actually sticking to the stick the way it should. This is due to the fact you've got that 70 milliseconds latency. The camera feed in the background and the AR kit that's thinking about is not actually synced with the returned frame. And so you get this weird floating effect that pulls you right out. So this was probably the biggest hurdle we had to overcome in order to get this experience to a point where it was believable. So the first thing we tried was a simple billboard. Same as any sprite or tree in a game. It sat right at the middle of the table. It faced the camera and direction to the camera, and it was locked. It didn't move around, it didn't shift because it was locked to the table. The problem was when you got close. If you saw me getting up really close and looking at the tanks, but as soon as you do that, you get massive pixelation, massive skewing of the buffer. Sometimes it just clips and disappears. So while it's good if you can keep people keeping their distance, it doesn't really work when you're getting up close, which is where AR is its most immersive. So we needed a mode that would hold it right to the camera, straight, put it right on the iPad. But that brought back the latency. So we couldn't stop that, so instead we decided to stop real life. We take the camera feed and we store it for every frame up to ascending. Then, when we finally get the returned rendered frame from the PC, we lock the two of them together, and that locksteps them. They're in sync, there's no more floating. You do have the problem where you've got 70 milliseconds of delay, but we found no one that could actually tell that was happening on the iPad. I mean, you're all welcome to come up and experiment yourself, but you couldn't actually see, you can't feel the fact that it's delayed while we were doing it until about, say, 100 milliseconds or so. All right, so that was the tech. Where can we go with this tech? So you may have seen the Apple Dev Days thing that they did earlier, a couple of months. They've released ARKit 2.0 with its shared experiences. It's something we thought about in the beginning. Having two iPads, two people, both of them looking and experiencing the same replay at the same time. It's all about social, getting each other together, and that's something we'd like to explore further. There's also the ability to track persistence. At the moment, we have to realign every time we run the experience. Being able to just have the thing locked down onto the table all the time, really easy to do. And also the ability, Luke mentioned, waving your hand in front of the iPad. If we could do that so that the hand actually occluded the rendered frame in the background, so the actual world, that would make it even more immersive. Your ability to put your hand there, actually almost physically touch something, and it all looks fine on the iPad. So there's also things to streaming we can do. I may not have mentioned, but we did TCP to send our frame, which isn't ideal. We'd prefer to use something like UDP, but the reliability helps with decompressing things on the iPad very fast, and it was always the iPad we had to deal with. We also used Unity to build the iPad app, but it probably would have been better of a native app because we would have had closer access to the hardware and able to do our metal shaders by hand, which would have been able to speed things up, especially when it comes to decompression and you're doing things that aren't just rendering pixels directly to the screen. We'd also like to send the actual camera from the iPad back to the PC so we can do better blending on the exterior. Those edges, like on the edge of the lighthouse there's like slight black pixels. We could actually blend into the background and have better particle effects. It works, but it could be better. For our client, we had to do a little bit of manipulation. We're not used to viewing the entire World of Tanks, the entire map from orbit effectively. We're optimized from running from a tank's point of view. So making sure about LODs, making sure your billboards work, especially when viewed top down, and making sure your game can run without fog are all things you need to consider to make the experience work in the real world. Now, we've mentioned the tether several times. It is probably the major limitation, and getting rid of that tether is something we'd like to do. The main problem being that the wireless technology just isn't actually there to make the experience viable. We can run wirelessly as it is right now. The latency just goes through the roof. There are technologies coming. Wi-Fi 6 is the next major Wi-Fi. It has the capacity, the throughput for us to actually provide the render frames. And it's also got things like beamforming technology coming in, which will actually reduce the amount of packet loss, things like that, that prevent us getting at 60 frames per second. WiGig is another one that's very similar. It's designed specifically for VR experiences. So the Vive Pro, the wireless nature of that, is done via WiGig. So that's another technology that could easily be applied to this to make the experience better and wireless. And if we wanted it to ship to people, consumers in the real world with their phones, 5G again has the theoretical capacity, but the fact is the latency probably isn't there, even though it's something they're focusing on, and the fact that the more people are using it, the worse it's just going to get. So Luke mentioned we tried headsets, the HoloLens. Can we do this on the headsets? Well, for HoloLens, the answer is no, primarily because our technique of storing the camera doesn't really work for real life unless you can actually delay time and space in some way. You're not going to be able to get that AR experience on your HoloLens. On something like the Vive, it is technically possible. You've got the cameras at the front. It's not live. But once you strap that thing to your face, you need to drop that latency way more than we ever could, because you just feel that it's the whole motion sickness thing, the whole problem with VR. The other thing we get asked about a lot is interactivity. Once they get it and they're viewed, then they want to play with it. So they want to be able to get in there, pinch and zoom, move the map around like it's Google Maps, and watch the tanks battle the way they want to watch it. We had people request wanting to drive the tanks around the maps themselves like a remote control tank. And doing an RTS game is like a perfect experience for this. The interface is arguably better than a console experience could give you. Another area is esports broadcasting. We have cameramen that know how to do their thing, and we can actually give them the ability to use the tech they're used to, rather than forcing them to learn to controllers. So we can use things that people already have to enhance our newer experiences we're trying to push. We can also bring things down from the screens. You don't go to a stadium to watch the television screen, you go to watch the action on the floor. So bringing big screens down onto the stage themselves and being able to have the map or your game just appear in the middle of the stadium is something that will really bring things to the people that are coming to actually pay to watch your games at stadiums, giving it a far better experience, connecting the people doing the actions to the actual actions in the game themselves. So what about my game? Well, it's entirely possible. All you have to do is to be able to send your back buffer, package it up and send it on a network and be able to receive a camera from an external source, and it would almost work with our app. There's some things that are specific to tanks, but nothing that affects the entire experience. We have had requests to have World of Warships done in a bathtub. I don't know why, but I don't ask questions. So that's what we did. We got World of Tanks onto the device. We got it shipped to Gamescom. I guess it went fairly well. We got some pretty good press out of it. It's a new way we can watch things, and we've got the quality that a normal AR experience on an iPad is never going to be able to match what you can get in your real games. There are things that need to get better, wirelessness, things like that, that will give us much better experiences, but that's things that are coming up. So if you have any questions or anything, Luke or Heidi would answer. I'm sure until we get kicked out of the room, you can come by and actually see how the iPad thing works without that black background, with actually technically working. So yeah, that's us. Thanks for coming.